Firstly, I'd just like to get your reaction to our interview with Steve Baker. I'm not sure if you caught it, but he's effectively now the first Conservative MP to publicly call for Dominic Cummings to go. Is he right?
I didn't catch the interview there, but look, I think this comes down to somebody who was trying to do the best by their 4-year-old child who was in danger of having both parents ill, and so tried to position himself where there was some family support from younger members of that family who could drop off food and the like, and perfectly legitimate questions to ask about these things, very straightforward answers have been forthcoming. Obviously I'd much rather speak to you about all the things we're doing in transport to build this country back after coronavirus, which is what I was hoping to talk to you about this morning.
Yes, somewhat derailed by news in the last couple of days. The point that Steve Baker was making on the childcare is that many of his constituents, many parents around the country have been grappling with exactly these concerns of what to do with childcare, how to look after their families when they fall ill, and that it will really stick in the throat to see what many people would assume to be one rule for them and one rule for the elite.
I think the most important thing about the guidance is it says if you are ill, make sure you self-isolate, you stay in that location. And the guidance also says, you have to, to paraphrase, you have to look for common sense, practical solutions. Particularly, it refers to when you're looking after children. And I mean, it's quite perfectly legitimate questions to ask. Dominic Cummings is very much in the public eye, but his child and wife much less so, and the child not at all, of course. And what they've done is gone to make sure that there's a support network around them. Obviously, both parents were concerned about being ill. I think the wife was already ill. So they've gone somewhere which was adjacent to, but not with, his parents, where both his sister and I believe a niece as well were able to bring food and take that to the door and that sort of thing, meaning that if they were both ill, that the child was at least getting some support. So I think they took perfectly sensible, rational steps to try and make sure, as anybody would do as a parent, that they could look after their child, and that's basically the long and the short of this story.
OK, so I'm keen to ask you just some very straightforward, factual questions, just to work out exactly what has happened. So when exactly did Dominic Cummings first show symptoms of coronavirus, and on what date did he make that journey from London to Durham?
Yeah, I don't want to disappoint you. Obviously, I'm Transport Secretary, so I'm expert in everything to do with building our infrastructure back, particularly in the post-corona world. So I don't know how all the times and dates for you, but I understand that he will have travelled up there towards the end of March and stayed there, remained there for 14 days, didn't leave the property in isolation as per the rules and the guidance.
OK, so that journey is 260 miles from London to Durham. That's 4.5 hours in a car with a small child and a sick wife. Did they stop at any point?
Well, you'll appreciate I wasn't with them, so I can't tell you exactly what the journey itself was like, but I do know that that Dominic Cummings, I saw a clip yesterday of him asking journalists to make sure they were spaced 2 meters apart, so I know he's a stickler for those rules about what to do to make sure you're following the 2-meter rule and the likes. I'm sure they took all the necessary precautions, but I'm afraid I don't have the detail of, I didn't sort of track, I haven't got the details of tracking of that journey.
I'll admit to being slightly disappointed that you don't have the detail, because we did flag these questions to you before you came on the show. A really unusual step for us, something that we've never really done before. But we acknowledge that you are Transport Secretary. We put the questions out there on social media in the hope that you might be able to find out the answers to them. These are really important questions, very simple, factual questions, and you're now coming on the programme saying you don't know. Why not?
Well, yeah, I mean, you appreciate it, Sophie. I came on the programme actually booked originally to talk about the transport announcements. I've absolutely perfectly legitimate to ask a whole range of questions, and questions have been asked about Mr. Cummings. Having said that, he's put out a statement, Downing Street's put out a statement, and they've been clear that he followed the guidance, that he did what we're all supposed to do if you were ill during this period, that particular period, lock down, remain in the same place, don't interact with other people, He did all of those things, looked after his young child. I'm afraid I don't have detail to the point of time, what time of day and how many stops. Sorry, I didn't hear.
He didn't stay in the same place. The household is supposed to stay in the same place if you have coronavirus. His wife was showing symptoms of coronavirus at that time, and he didn't stay in the same place.
Well, I mean, he did once they, were locked down. They sort of hunkered down and they stayed there for 14 days. And
yeah, that's after they travelled 260 miles.
Well, everyone has to sort of, if you're going to lock down, you go to the place you're going to stay. And as I say, the guidance is clear that, particularly where young children are involved, it says that it actually refers to children specifically, and it says, this isn't a sort of perfect science. Essentially, the guidance says you'll want to take the steps which are practical to be able to look after your children, or child in this particular case, which in their case meant having a sister or a niece who could drop off food, and that's what they did. They then remained in that space. And I think there were more stories today I was seeing about, has he travelled backwards and forwards, accusations that he then went back up to Durham again further times. I understand completely untrue. When he came back to London, which was on the 14th of April, I see, he's remained in London since and hasn't been back to Durham. So that there's lots of things being said here which is completely untrue. Actually, the basic story is actually pretty straightforward. Husband and wife are ill. They hunker down. They look after their 4-year-old, and they don't move until they're better. And coming back down to London afterwards would have been travelling for essential work, which was always allowed to do as well.
OK, so just to be crystal clear, because this is important, you're effectively saying that the two new allegations, the first, that Mr Cummings travelled back up to Durham on the 19th of April, and the second is that he was seen by a witness, apparently, in Barnard Castle, 30 miles from Durham, on the 12th of April. You're going on the record to say that both of those allegations are not true.
I certainly know that the first one that you mentioned of travelling back up, I know that's not true. It's put out a statement saying actually
so how about
back
Barnard
in
Castle?
London on the 14th. I'm afraid I don't know, but if that date was true, that would have been outside of the 14-day lockdown period. But I'm afraid I don't have information on that. But I do know that it's not the case that he's travelled backwards and forwards, which seemed to be a major part of the stories I saw in the paper today.
Have you asked Number 10 the answers to these questions, or did they just not tell you?
Well, Number 10 put out a statement, or Mr Cummings had put out a statement with Number 10 answering, a whole variety of points. And there seems to have been a lot of confusion over this story. For example, I was going to say, for example, there was a suggestion that the police had been involved, and that was in, I think, the original story. But I understand actually some confusion over that. The police were actually advising about some security matters. This is all very interesting, and you're absolutely right to ask the questions. As I say, I'm sure there's a level of interest about it, but actually probably how we build ourselves out of coronavirus, big announcements like the £1 billion programme I announced yesterday to build the A66 all the way into a dual carriageway from Penrith to Scotch Corner, things which actually matter to people's everyday lives, or will do as we come out of coronavirus, are obviously things that I'm an expert in, I can talk to you about, and had hoped to get a bit of time to discuss today.
I'm sure it's very disappointing to not be able to talk about the A66 as much as you like on the programme, Mr Shapps. But just to pick you up on what you just said about the police, because it does feel like there is some confusion here. Because at yesterday's press conference, you said nobody from the police had spoken to Dominic Cummings or a member of his family. But since then, Durham Constabulary said on Tuesday, March the 31st, our officers were made aware that Dominic Cummings had travelled from London to Durham. An officer made contact the following morning by telephone. During that conversation, Mr Cummings' father confirmed that his son had travelled with his family from London to the northeast. So who is being dishonest, you or Durham Police?
So I think I was saying yesterday about this specific issue. I think, in fact, it was Mr Cummings' father who contacted the police, not the other way round, and actually it was in reference to security advice, which you'll appreciate the family don't want to go into, not about this specific issue.
OK. So when did the Prime Minister find out that Mr Cummings had travelled to Durham?
Well, as your viewers will probably remember, the Prime Minister during exactly the same period was pretty ill, and in fact eventually in hospital and in ICU. So I don't think this will have been sort of high on the Prime Minister's agenda as he lay there in hospital.
I just want to come back there, because we believe that Dominic Cummings travelled to Durham on the 28th to the 29th of March, when we were told that the Prime Minister, although he was showing symptoms of coronavirus and was self-isolating, that he was still leading the government and that he was working from number 10. So were we misled about how serious the Prime Minister's illness was at that time?
Sorry, I'm not quite clear what you mean by that connection. We know the Prime Minister was unwell. We know he carried on working. That's absolutely true. And then he went into hospital, very well documented. I think everyone knew what was going on there. And then, of course, ended up in intensive care after that. So,
sorry, the point of my question is that I absolutely accept that the Prime Minister became very ill. But at the time that we believe that Dominic Cummings made this journey to Durham, we were told that the Prime Minister was still working as usual. Oh, yes, yeah, I mean, he was. So why didn't he know about it then? Or did he know about it? Oh, you have to forgive me, Sophie. I don't actually know, whether the Prime Minister tracks every single move of Dominic Cummings. I think he knew that Dominic Cummings was ill and was self-isolating, which was exactly what he was doing with his wife and his child. OK, another question that we did flag to you in advance. Now, the reason I'm asking these questions is because, people around the country have been following the lockdown to the letter, and many of them in really difficult situations, making incredibly difficult sacrifices for themselves and for their families. I mean, just to give one example, and there are many more, Ismail Mohammed Abdul Wahab died without his family at his bedside on the 30th of March. Now, his parents and siblings couldn't even attend his funeral. He was 13 years old. And while that was happening, a man centrally involved in drawing up the recommendations or the rules for what people should be doing was travelling to see his family. How is that right?
I mean, I suspect nearly everyone watching knows people who have been affected and people who've died from coronavirus. I can think of 9 or 10 people that I've known directly or indirectly. And, my heart goes out to everybody who's been affected by this virus. And it is true that people haven't been able to attend, funerals and families and so on and so forth. But I just want to be completely clear about what's happened here. This is not Dominic Cummings went to see his parents. He didn't, he was in a separate adjacent property. This is somebody who followed the guidelines by going to sort of lock down in order to be in the best place to ensure that provision was made for a 4-year-old who clearly would not have been able to look after himself. And as the guidance makes clear, you must do in this situation the thing which will look after children for their welfare in the best possible way, which is what people would expect, and any father would, mother and father would want to do exactly that. And that's what's happened in this situation here. What many people will be trying to get their head around is that one of the government's great successes has been getting people to obey the rules of the lockdown and driving down the cases of this deadly virus as a result. But now members of the Cabinet seem to be saying that you need to use your own common sense, that the rules are there for interpretation, that they're guidelines, that you should do what's right for your own family. Is saving the job of Dominic Cummings really more important than getting people to adhere to the lockdown? I really want to push back on that, actually, Sophie, because the absolute critical part of this is remaining in the same location whilst you go through the 14 days of isolation, which is what happened here. It wasn't though they were travelling around during the period they were ill. They stayed in the same place to do that. They made sure the support network was around them, but they did that. And the guidance didn't say you must only drive a mile to do that or whatever. Clearly, every family's position will have been different through this period. But look, as I said, and I don't want to sort of. This obviously is important and perfectly legitimate questions to ask. They've also been answered, I think, pretty clearly. And apart from the A66, the bus and tram services that we spent £286 million to bring them back to full service, which is something else that I've been announcing this weekend, and all these other things, I think will actually in the end be much more significant for people watching your programme, because what we need to know is how we're going to deal with the recovery stage of this, particularly with the 1st of June, which is the earliest possible moment to go into phase 2 of this coming up shortly. All of this is probably more interesting than how one family looked after their 4-year-old by staying in a single location and not, as been suggested in the newspapers, driving back and forth and back and forth. I think there are sort of big issues here which matter to the country as a whole. And whilst it's great to get into the detail of this, I think most of these questions have been answered now.
OK, thanks for the job tips. Much appreciated. Now, one of the things, of course, that many people will legitimately be very interested in knowing is about schools and nurseries. Whether or not they're actually going to be opening on June the 1st. It's only 8 days away, something that affects, of course, millions of families. So will schools and nurseries, some primary school age year groups and nurseries be seeking to have children attending from the 1st of June?
Yeah, that certainly is the plan, and I think it's really important because we're in a position where children are clearly missing out on very vital formative parts of their education, and particularly in that sort of reception year, year 1, year 6, which are absolutely crucial moments in children's education. We've seen this happen in other countries, Denmark and in Germany, in France now. Some of the schools are going back. In those cases, as we would do here, very cautiously, not in large class sizes, taking all of the necessary precautions. And elsewhere where this has been done, the infection rate has been kept the same as well. So we've seen it work elsewhere. I think there may even be over 20 countries now who've sent a limited number of children back. And so I think it is important that we try to do that from the 1st of June, and that's certainly the intention.
OK, thank you. And just finally, you really have drawn the shortest of short straws this weekend. Signed up to do that daily briefing yesterday from Downing Street, today's morning TV round, hoping to talk about your transport announcement, and then the Dominic Cummings story broke. Were you tempted to switch off your alarm this morning?
No, Sophie, I'd miss out speaking to you. And look, I appreciate you giving me at least a moment to talk about some of these transport announcements and our approach to this, which is going to be to build our way back from coronavirus. And look, this has been a huge moment for this country and globally. We've never seen anything like it in 100 years. But how we respond now and how we build back and how we create the infrastructure, the jobs and the skills and bring this country back to life again is going to be absolutely essential. And as you said, I had hoped to be talking about that, all of those things through the press conference yesterday and these media interviews this morning. But I appreciate you giving me a small opportunity to do that. We're bringing back the buses and the trams and the trains. The important thing is that people avoid the rush hour, don't go and use them unless you absolutely can't walk, cycle or drive, because we will only be able to take about a fifth of the normal passenger numbers, even when we have 100% of the services back in place.